Okay, so this is a video tutorial on how to use GitHub. I'll cover a few key things. First, I'm going to talk about what GitHub is and why you would want to use it. Then I'll walk through sort of how to create an account. And then finally, I'll show you some examples of um, pushing and pulling content from the GitHub repository. So that's what we'll talk about today. So first, what is GitHub? GitHub is a highly used highly used piece of software that's typically used for version control. Okay, so GitHub is typically used on software development projects, projects where you might have more than just one person working on a piece of code or working on a website that you're creating, something like that. And so what GitHub allows you to do then is create a centralized repository for everyone working in the group to update or upload their information, and allows you to document those changes as you're walking through the project together. So the biggest question that people have is typically, why not just use Dropbox or some other cloud-based system? And the reason why we don't want to use Dropbox for things like software development is that when two people are working simultaneously on a file in Dropbox, whoever saves that file first, their changes take precedent over someone else, right? So simultaneously working on things like a piece of computer code or a website isn't very conducive if you're using Dropbox. Okay, so typically people use GitHub to control and track changes in software development projects. So that's why you would want to use it. And then secondly, if you're going to work in any industry that involves any kind of software development, even in the capacity of a technical writer or editor, you're probably going to be expected to use GitHub. You're probably going to be expected to make your edits or your changes or your documentation and upload them to the repository in GitHub. So all that being said, it's a really useful tool. It's easy to use, but there's a little bit of a learning curve. So that's why I'm making this video. So the first thing I want to show you is then how to create a GitHub account. So you'll need an account. It's a free thing, but you'll need it. And so you'll go to the URL github.com, and you'll see this interface. And you can choose a username, an email, and a password, and you can sign up for GitHub. So just like you would sign up for any other web-based account, you would provide that information and it would create an account for you. I already have an account, so I'm going to log in and kind of show you what the interface looks like. So this is what the interface would look like. I already have some repositories, but this is your sort of home base for GitHub. And so what is a repository? So just to kind of talk about some of the language and the lingo that's used with GitHub. First, a repository is simply just a project. Okay, so think of it like a folder on your computer, your desktop computer. Right? So if you're creating a website, you probably put it all in a folder called website or something like that. So a repository is just a word for project. Okay, so right now I have 7 projects going on that I run through GitHub. So what you would do, and I'll just sort of show you, you might use this in lots of different contexts, but I'll show you an example of what this might look like. And then we'll talk more about this maybe in a later video or in class. So the first thing you can do is create a new repository. So that will take you to this interface, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it video tutorial. You can write a description. This is a repository for a video tutorial. And then the last thing you'll want to do is click the initialize repository. You can't make it private unless you pay for your GitHub account, which is $7 a month. I don't use GitHub for anything that I would deem confidential, right? So if I have research that I'm working on that I don't want to share with the public, I'm not going to run it through GitHub. So just keep that in mind. This is public. Things that you commit to this GitHub repository will be public. But you fill that out, you click initialize with a README, and then click create repository. And what we see here is our repository is created. And here you see this is sort of the view of all of the files in the repository. And the first file that gets created is called a README file. Literally, it just says this. It just says the name of the repository and then what you put in the description. This is a repository for a video tutorial. You don't really have to do anything without. You don't really have to do anything else with that README file. If you're working with people across the country or in a different country and you want to use this file as sort of, this is how we're going to use this repository, you know, upload only on Fridays or make changes only to these files, things like that, you could put those instructions in that README file. But for our purposes, we're not really going to touch that README file. Okay, so we've created this repository. Its sort of home base URL is here. You can see in the browser, github.com/username/ whatever the repository name is. That's your home base. But you don't work, if you're working on a software development project or really any kind of project, you're not working in your web browser, right? You're working on your computer. So what I want to talk about now is really how it works once you've created a repository. So if you're going to be working on a computer from school, a computer from home, and a computer and a laptop that you work with at a coffee shop, you might have 3 different computers, and that doesn't really matter because your repository is on the GitHub server and you can export and import the repository onto your local machine. Okay, so the way that we import a repository in a local machine, on a local machine, is called pulling a repository. Okay, pulling content from the repository. But before we do that, what we have to do is we have to basically create a copy of that repository on our local machines, on our computers. So to do that, GitHub runs through the command line. And so this is where people start to get scared or really just don't decide not to use GitHub because they are not familiar with the command line and just don't feel like they want to use the command line. But what we'll do today is I'll just walk through some of the very basic command line commands that you'll use for GitHub, and hopefully that will be enough for you to sort of get your feet wet and start using GitHub. So command line on a Mac, that the program is actually called Terminal. I believe it's just called command line on a Windows machine, but you're going to pull up something that looks like this. And so what we see here is I'm basically going to create 2 versions of this repository, one as Joe and one as Sarah, just to give you an idea of what would this look like if we had 2 people working on a project together. Okay, so the first thing we do in command line, I'm going to be Joe here in the top of the screen. The first thing we do on the command line is we want to find out where we are. So when you open up the terminal, if you type in ls on a Mac, it lists all of the files in the folder that you're currently in. Okay, so currently I'm just in CYL0017 money sign, and here are all of the folders or files inside of that location. On a Windows machine, you would have to type in dir for directory listing. Okay, so what I'm going to do is this is a folder called Joe that's sitting on my desktop. I need to get to my desktop. So on the command line, you have to manually specify where you want to go. So to do that, you use the command cd, which stands for change directory, and I want to go onto my desktop. So now you can see we've moved from just CYL0017 to desktop. Okay, now we need to change directories to Joe. So now we're in Joe. So we're inside of this folder on my desktop. And now that we're inside of the folder, that's the destination for our GitHub repository. Here is the first Git command that you'll have to know. So it's git clone, and that means clone or copy the entire repository. And then you go back to GitHub, and you just want to copy this entire URL. So I'm going to do git clone, wherever the folder we want it to be, and then the URL, okay? And that'll show you, yes, I have done exactly what we need to do. I've cloned video tutorial inside of Joe. So if I open up this folder Joe, you'll see there's now magically a folder called video tutorial inside of it. And inside of that, there is magically a file called readme. That's that initial file that I created. So now I want to do the same thing for Sarah. So Sarah's a different person, and so she wants a repository on her machine. So we need to go change directory desktop, and then change directory Sarah. Okay, and just for your own purposes, you may or may not need to use this to move backwards in a repository or to move backwards out of a folder. You can do change directory and then ... So that took me back to desktop. So you may find yourself needing to do that at some point. That's just a nice little shortcut. So let's go back to Sarah, and then let's clone the repository inside of Sarah's folder. Okay? So they each have their own repository. You can see it's done. Let's just make sure. Magically video tutorial appears, and magically readme appears. Okay? So they're both working on the same repository. So what we want to do now is let's just create something real quick. Let's start with a grocery list. So let's just say these two are working on a grocery list, and Joe wants to put apples, bananas, milk, and vegetables on the grocery list. Okay, so here's the list. And then I'm going to save this in Joe's repository. So Joe's repository is right there inside of video tutorial, and I'm just going to name this grocery.html. So it's an HTML file. And another thing you can do, this is Sublime Text. It's a free text editor for Mac. I don't know if there's a Windows version, but I would highly recommend it if there is. But you can add a folder to your project in Sublime Text. So just for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to add this folder. So this is Joe's folder, and I'm going to add Sarah's folder down here. So you can kind of see the magic happen as it's happening. Sarah, video tutorial. All right. So we've got grocery.html, and so Joe is ready then to add this to the GitHub repository, right? So right now he's just working in a folder. It's not magically connected to the internet. It's just a folder on his computer that has grocery.html. You have to, in GitHub, manually then add this back to the repository. And so to do that, it's basically a three-step process. So the first thing we can do is here's a command called Git Status. So if you're in your GitHub folder, and we're inside of our GitHub folder, actually we're not, we're inside of Joe. So we want to be inside of video tutorial. Now that we're inside of it, we can do Git Status, and this will tell us sort of the status of the repository, of the files inside of the repository. And so it knows that we added a new file, grocery.html. Anything in red means it hasn't been officially added to the repository. So step one is we need to do git add grocery.html. and that adds it to the repository. So if we do git status again, we can see, oh, it's green. So it went from red to green. So now we've officially added the file. Now we want to officially commit the file. So committing the file means I'm committing to the changes. This is going to be officially committed, but it's still not going to be uploaded onto the repository on the internet, on the GitHub server. I'm just going to commit to the changes, and this stage of commit is really important. So it seems like an extraneous step, so why don't you just upload it right away? Well, what the commit does is it forces you to create a comment about the commit. So you do -m, git commit -m, and then in quotation marks, you can describe what you've done, right? So I added a grocery list HTML file, okay? And so we've committed it with the comment. It's now ready to be uploaded or exported onto the GitHub repository. So let's do git, here's the last command that you'll need, git push, and then that's all you have to do, git push. And basically that's the last process. So if we go back to our GitHub sort of centralized location and we refresh, you can see grocery.html has been added to our repository, right? So back in our home base, on the Git server, we can see a couple things. One, we've added the file, but two, it also adds that documentation. So I added a grocery list HTML file. Very helpful if there's 5 people, 10 people working on a project. You can see, okay, why did this person add this file, or what changes did they make to this file? It's just a way to document everything that's happening in a project, which is really important. Okay, so now let's move down to Sarah. So we're inside Sarah's folder. We want to be inside video tutorial, which is her repository. So we've changed directories to video tutorial. And what we want to do is, I'm Sarah. I'm not sure if Joe has finished the grocery list. He said he was going to. Not sure if he actually got to it. I want to do a Git pull and just pull all of the information that has all of the latest changes that have been pushed to the repository. And so you can see there has been 6 insertions, so there's 6 lines that have been added, and 1 file changed. And so you can see, and if you open up Sarah's repository, you can see it's been added. Magically appears grocery.html. And so there it is. Okay, so now we're down here on the bottom left screen, and Sarah says, well, we also need some cookies. Obviously, we need some cookies. And some, you know, I don't think we need regular milk. I think we need soy milk. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to say, you know what? Those are all the changes I've done. I'm going out to lunch. I'm going to just upload these changes to GitHub. So again, we do the same thing. We start with Git Status, and you don't have to do the Git Status. This is just sort of for illustrative purposes, but you can see we've modified grocery.html. We need to add that. So git add. And another thing you can do is, if you have, right, we're working with 1 file right now, but if you have 10 files or 20 files that you've changed, you can do git add -A, okay? And that will add all of the files that you've created or changed. So if we do git status again, we can see we're green now. So that means we're good to commit. So git commit -m, which is our commenting feature, and I'm going to say I've added cookies and changed milk to soy milk, right? So now that's clearly documented. We've committed it. Last step, we're going to push it up to the repository. Okay. Now let's look back online and see how that changed the repository. And I want to show you a few things here. internet is being very slow, so bear with me here. Okay, so now I've updated the repository and the file is showing the latest comment. I've added cookies and changed milk to soy milk. One thing you can do is you can actually click the file and you can see the history of the file. So again, let's just say, you know, someone is working on a file they're not supposed to be working on. You can see who's been working on it. You can see what they've done and how they've committed it. And the thing is you can't just make changes without adding that comment and without pushing all of those changes back up to Git, right? And so that's really important to know. Even if someone is working on files they shouldn't be working on, unless they've pushed it up to the GitHub repository, those changes aren't automatically reflected. Something that would happen if you were working in Dropbox, for example. Okay, so that's nice. Now, what happens when two people are working on the same file and they both push changes, but the changes conflict? So let's take a look at that example. The first thing I want to do is, you can see Joe's grocery.html file looks different than Sarah's. So what we want to do is we need to git pull as Joe, and we can see if we update. Now when we see the updated grocery.html file, it automatically updates, right? So we have soy milk and cookies, okay? But Joe says, I don't like soy milk, I'd rather have almond milk. And Sarah says, you know what, that's true, I'd rather just have milk. So they're both, let's just say they're both working on this at the same time. We gotta make sure we save these. And let's say, you know, Joe decides to add, and we can do git add all, git commit -m, changed soy to almond milk, and git push. Okay, so he's pushed that up, and before Sarah has a chance to pull down that change, she's also said, hey, I changed it back to regular milk, I'm going to push my stuff back up too. So git add, git commit -m, changed soy back to regular milk. So it's a milk fiasco, and we do git push. So what's happened now is we've both pushed things, but there is a conflict, right? So we've both pushed our versions, but line 4, there seems to be a conflict, right? So what happens when that happens, when there's a conflict? Well, it would show up when, and you can see, error, failed to push some references to GitHub video tutorial. Hint, updates were rejected because the remote work contains work that you do not have locally. This is caused by another repository pushing the same reference. Okay, so we know that that's happening. What do we do? What happens? Well, we can do a git status real quick. It says that our directory is clean. We can do a git pull, and if we do a git pull, so what this will show up now when we do a git pull, and we'll see we have a conflict of content. So what happens is when you eventually go back to pull, that conflict shows up. Okay, and it looks a little complex and complicated. It's really not. Basically, here is the conflict. Here in head is where just a delineating marker of this is what you put. So Sarah put milk, and then there's this dashed line, and it says this person with this user ID, which is Joe, wanted almond milk. So before we can move ahead, before we can actually move on with this project, we have to make a decision, right? So I'm going to say, you know what? I'm going to defer to Joe on this one. He's the milk expert. So I'm just going to save this as almond milk, right? So now I've saved this. Once you have fixed the conflict, you can add it and commit it, and then you would just comment, you know, fixed milk fiasco, and then push it back up. Okay. So now that we've pushed it back up, we're all on the same page. So if we do a poll here as Joe, we should be good to go. And the only thing that changed was some of the formatting, but now we're all working from the same file. Okay, but the main thing is that Git will tell you when there is a conflict, right? So if there is a problem, you know, you guys can't decide on what kind of milk to bring, Git will automatically say, well, line 5 looks different. You both pushed up at the same time, or you both pushed before you pulled. That's a conflict, and it'll tell you where the conflict exists. It will ask you to fix or rectify the conflict, and then you can move on once you've rectified the conflict. Okay. So those are the basic rundown of all of the Git commands. So let me just show you one last thing. So let's move up here as Joe at the top of the screen. If you just type in Git into command line, it'll show you all of the different Git commands. So add, bisect, sorry, it's formatted weird. Those are all the Git commands. You don't really need, the ones that we covered today are the ones that you're really going to need, right? So git add to add the file to the repository, git commit to document and commit the file, and then git push to upload it to the GitHub repository. Those are the big ones. And then git status will kind of, is probably the first thing you should do before starting any work every day, is git status and just make sure your repository is up to date. And what you want to see is your branch is up to date with origin/master. Origin/master refers back to this master repository that is on GitHub server. Okay. I want to quickly talk about workflow. So when I'm working to develop a website, I'll git commit and git push several times throughout the day. So if I've made major changes, if I feel like I've made major changes and I want to document those changes, I'll do a commit and an add, or a commit and a push. And I might do that 10 times a day. I might do that 20 times in a day. But, you know, the more you do it, and I'm not saying you should do it after you've changed every single line, but the more you do it, the more well documented your project is, right? So if something breaks, or if you're lost or you're not sure where you left off, the more documentation you have about your project, the better off you're going to be. The second thing I want to mention about workflow, so you'll likely be working on computers in a computer lab. They'll all have GitHub installed into them, but basically what you would do is you would have to clone your directory every time you worked on a new computer, right? So let's just say you're working on a project for class. You've created this whole big website on your local computer and you've pushed it up to the GitHub repository. So you've got it in your GitHub repository, then you come to class and you sit at a computer you've never sat at before. Well, if that's the context or if that's the case, all you would have to do then is to go on that computer's command line and clone the repository again, right? So you would do your git clone, and again, just as a reminder, you would use the URL of your master repository. And you would clone it, and basically, again, that would create a folder on that local machine. So any changes you've made are only changes to the files on that local machine. And when you were done working, or when class ended, or right before class ended, and you're working on the machine, you would make sure to add, commit, and push all of those changes back up to the repository. Once you've done that, once you've added, committed, and changed all of those things, you can actually take this original folder that you've cloned and you can delete it, right? So if you don't want anyone else working on it or messing with your files, you can go ahead, if I'm Joe, I can go ahead and just move this to the trash, and it's not a big deal, right? All of my files are still stored in this master repository. Now, let's just say I come back 3 days later, and I am, in my desktop, or actually, let me reopen. Sorry about that. And I come back 3 days later, just to show you, I want to reopen a terminal. And I reopen the terminal and I'm here again. I would change directory back into my desktop, back into folders Joe. And remember, I deleted this out of Joe, so the repository is not inside, there's nothing inside of Joe right now. But let's say I come back a few days later and I want to work on this, I would just git clone back into that folder or wherever you wanted to clone it, and we would be back in action, right? Magically, video tutorial appears with all of the latest changes, okay? So that's just a little bit about workflow. Do your commits and your pushes often. And the real big advantage of Git is you can work on files on any local computer. It doesn't matter which one, so long as it has Git installed. And you can make sure that by cloning the repository or by pushing and pulling into the repository, you can make sure that you're working on the latest version of the file. You're working on the correct version of the file, but also working on the right parts of the file, right? So if you've documented things correctly, you can say, well, grocery.html, we need to rewrite this entire grocery list, and you can put that into the documentation, and then the next time Sarah comes back and sees, oh, Joe says we have to redo the entire grocery list, she knows exactly what to work on, right? So it's a means of documentation, but it's also a means of communication within a project. Okay, so that's GitHub in a short, not really short, but relatively short video tutorial. Hopefully that was helpful. We'll talk more.